Our next speaker is Henry Bartelet. Henry? Henry, can you please share your screen and turn on your microphone and camera?
Good day.
Good day, Henry. Henry is from James Cook University, and his talk is titled Understanding Microeconomic Adaptation Feedbacks to Enable Successful Policy Design in a Climate Change Context. Thanks, Henry.
All right. Thank you. Do you see my slides?
Yes, I do. It's in presentation mode. It's looking good.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so thanks for all the 170 people that are still in the conference. I hope everybody's still awake after 2 long days, but I'm hoping for the best. Yeah, so in the last 2 days, I learned a lot about how different coral species and fish species are adapting to climate change. So my presentation will have a slight variation on that, is that I will look at how humans are adapting to the same kind of stresses. So this is a presentation about a review paper, which I've done together with my PhD supervisors. So a little bit of background. So I'm not a marine scientist by training. So my educational background is in economics and systems theory. And I've been mostly working in my career in the kind of topics that Ove was discussing. So about energy transition and how decarbonization can be realized. So before I started my PhD, I was actually working in a Norwegian risk management company. And there we made a forecast of the future energy transition. And basically what we found is that it's very likely that we're gonna reach a significant amount of warming in the future. So between 2 and 3 degrees warming towards the end of the century is quite likely, even though that a lot of good policies will be implemented, it will probably not be quick enough. So, you know, with that understanding, I kind of shifted into the field of human and economic adaptation to climate change, which I and with me many others believe is still a largely unexplored field. And then unfortunately, coral reefs provide a great example to study economic adaptations because they will be severely affected, as Ove also showed in his presentation. So my main question is, how are industries and people dependent on reefs going to adapt to this climate change? So for example, countries like Indonesia and the Philippines are highly dependent on coral reef fish. And here in Australia, regions like Northern Queensland are highly dependent on coral reef tourism. So what does global warming look like in 2020? Well, we actually had like 4 major climate events. Probably I even missed a few smaller ones, but these were the ones that were in the news. So in January, you had the bushfires here in Australia. In April, you also had the coral bleaching. And then in May, there was a massive typhoon hitting the Ganges Delta in India. And then in June, I think this is actually still ongoing, is a marine heat or a normal heat wave in Siberia, which is also producing a lot of wildfires. So this is the only slide with theory, which I will bore you with. But basically, microeconomic adaptation, it's a bit of a complicated word to say how households and firms are adapting. And it has been acknowledged that the way that the incentives that we can use to help microeconomic actors to adapt are understudied. That's basically because we have a very limited empirical knowledge about how these actors are actually adapting to different kind of changes. So what you see here on the picture on the right is a kind of an example of adaptation. So this is in Bangladesh, where farmers are adapting to sea level rise and flooding. So these are the so-called floating farms. So that help them to keep producing food while they are facing these tough climate conditions. And then the adaptation literature often assesses adaptive capacity as a proxy for potential adaptation. Yet little is known about how this adaptive capacity translates to actual adaptations. So that relationship has been argued to be far from direct. So my research approach, to learn more about the way in which private actors are adapting to climate change, I did a systemic empirical review to see how these actors are responding. So there's not too many studies about coral reef industry, so that's why I also look at other sectors like farming. So actually most of these studies are about agriculture. So I found 77 papers, mainly in Africa and Asia. And most of these studies were post-2007, so they were following up a World Bank study. So I had like 5 very simple questions, so I'm sure everybody will understand this. So my first question was, what type of climate change are they adapting to? What kind of measures are they implementing? What determines the kind of measures they're implementing? Are the measures successful? and are government policies helpful? So on this first question, so what type of climate change are the most actors adapting to? So you see in the graph on the right, you see that most actors are actually adapting to gradual changes in rainfall and temperature. And there's also a significant amount of papers on extreme events, so things like flooding and extreme storms. So in terms of the adaptation measures, so I found like 100 different types of measures, which I clustered in 6 categories. So there's diversification within livelihood, which is the most common. So this could be things like changing the crop type and the variety, or changing the firm location. There's also changes in the mode of operating, so how these actors are operating their firm or their farms. So this could be, for example, the change in the harvesting dates, or to have different kind of land use techniques. And then there's also a significant amount of natural resource management strategies. So this could be, for example, soil and water conservation, and the changes in the fertilizer use. And then there's diversification between livelihoods. So it could be migration or switching to off-farm activities. Then there's also relief measures. So you could, for example, sell livestock, or you could rely on your savings. And then there's also finally protection measures. So you could, for example, plant trees to cover from the heat. You could elevate land, which would help against flooding, or you could have something like crop insurance. So to look at what determines what kind of measures are implemented by different actors, I use the adaptive capacity framework by Sinner and Barnes. So basically they have defined 6 domains of adaptive capacity. So the first one is agency, which is the power and freedom to change. Then there's assets, which is access to financial resources, for example, and other assets. There's flexibility, which is the flexibility, for example, to switch between strategies. Organization deals with social networks and social capital. There's learning, the capacity to generate, absorb, and process information. And then there's social cognitive factors, which are actually kind of the psychosocial factors that enable the mobilization of assets. This could be things like the attitude to risk and personal experience. And then these we can use to look at how they impede or enable different kind of adaptation measures. So yeah, I'm also wondering, there were a lot of presentations about the adaptive capacity of fish and other species. So are there also these kind of frameworks which they're using that would be interesting to compare? I think one advantage of humans is that we have this reasoning about the future, which most animals don't have. So in this graph, which is a bit more complicated, you see on the left side, you see the adaptive capacity domains. So the 6 domains I just showed. And then on the right side, you see the different adaptation types. So in this case, when you see a connecting flow, like a blue flow, it means that any factor within one of those domains has a positive impact on the likelihood of implementing a measure within one of these categories. So you see that most significant factors come from the assets and the learning categories. Then if you look at the diversification between livelihoods, you see quite a big red flow coming from assets. So actors which have a lot of assets, they're less likely to diversify between livelihoods. But actors which have a lot of flexibility, they are more likely to switch between livelihoods and less likely to diversify within their livelihoods. So in terms of the adaptation outcomes, there hasn't been much theory about this. So basically there has been a definition which I have translated into 3 outcome domains. So there's outcomes in terms of resilience, in terms of the microeconomic outcomes, and in terms of externalities, so social and environmental impacts. So the next thing I did was to look in these papers whether they discuss any outcomes of these adaptations. So what I found is, for example, that if you look at the crop types, so if you change crop types, that could lead to a higher return per hectare, but it could also be susceptible for future climate change. And then just to go through a few other ones, for example, if you look at the irrigation, so adaptation could be to use more irrigation, which can improve farm productivity, but then it can actually deplete water, which would be an environmental externality. So you see that there's trade-offs between different kind of outcomes. So why should we care about outcomes? Yeah, so this is kind of what I've done up till now. So we identified and categorized the common adaptation measures. We also have quite some data about the links between adaptive capacity and adaptation measures, but we don't have a lot of data on the outcomes. And we need these outcomes to see what the effect will be on adaptive capacity. So there's sequential linkages between adaptive capacity, adaptation measures, and adaptation outcomes. So in terms of government policies, so I found that information policies are the most prevalent and also the most positive. So this is the effect on the likelihood of adapting to climate change. Let's see if I can go through some of the implications for government policy. Yeah, so one key thing here, the second point, is that assets are a dominant determinant, but there's little evidence for the success of asset-focused policies, which I found interesting. And then there's also conflicting evidence for other interventions, and some policies might actually reduce the resilience of microeconomic actors. So with that, I like to go to my 3 key messages. So the first one is that microeconomic adaptation is becoming increasingly important in a warming and volatile climate. So think coral bleaching here in the center. And then microeconomic outcomes, through their effect on savings, are a key enabler of adaptation, although economic incentives could promote adaptations with negative environmental outcomes. So we have seen some evidence of that. But yeah, it's important to realize that the economic outcomes are likely to be the most important for these firms, because that is what keeps them alive. And finally, without understanding adaptation dynamics, government policy might promote adaptations with undesired outcomes. So they could, for example, by subsidizing firms, they might actually decrease how much they learn to adapt to future climate change. So they become dependent on the government policy. So with that being said, I would like to thank everybody, and also I'm still really in the beginning of my research, so I'm not an expert on this. So if anyone has any advice on how to move forward or other things to add, please send me an email, and I'm happy to discuss further. Thank you.